You cannot make your boss not toxic. It's who they are. In an ideal world, you'd be able to quit your job and get away from your toxic manager. But the reality is, you probably can't do that. Bills aren't gonna pay themselves, and you're not quite ready to sell feed pics on the internet. So in today's video, I'm going to share 5 simple strategies to cope with a toxic boss without quitting your job. But before we can get into those strategies, I have 3 quick caveats that we need to cover. I make videos for hundreds of thousands of people on the internet, and I want you to know how to apply these strategies to your unique toxic boss situation. So first, when it comes to dealing with a toxic manager, size matters. Not in terms of how much of an ass they are, but in terms of the size of your company. The way you navigate dealing with a toxic boss is very different when you're at a company with 100,000 employees versus a teeny tiny company where your toxic manager is the only manager. Of course, I'll speak to some of these nuances throughout the video. Caveat 2, even though you can't walk in and quit dramatically like you fantasize about every day,
you can take this job and shove it.
That doesn't mean that you shouldn't be plotting too. Over the years, I have helped thousands of people get out and over their toxic jobs, and a shockingly large number of people were still in their toxic jobs and couldn't quit. Like, who's quitting in this economy? My clients have been stuck in toxic jobs for various reasons. Like, they live in a place without any other options. They have a government job that offers a pension and they are way too close to walk away from it. Or they work in industries where the toxicity is really baked into the culture. They can't escape it. Thing is, you never know what's going to happen. Layoffs have become a permanent feature in the private sector and now in the public sector as well. So I want you to think of your escape plot as an insurance policy, even if you're not acting on it. And frankly, a lot of people that I've worked with have had a level of peace just by having options, even when those options are just in their head. Who knows? Your escape plan might bring you to a totally unexpected place like me. I ended up leaving my lucrative tech startup career to launch my YouTube channel and training services company. I never would have guessed that one. Now, there is one more caveat. You need to know what type of toxic manager that you have, and I do have a video on that on my channel. But more importantly, you need to know what makes them toxic for you. Which brings us to the first strategy to deal with a toxic boss that you cannot quit. One of my clients, we'll call them Leslie because I don't use real names to protect the privacy of my clients, worked with the worst kind of toxic boss. We'll call him Richard because he's a real dick. Richard wasn't a toxic boss because he was an idiot who lacked the ability to do better. He was incredibly smart and he was charismatic with the right people. But with his subordinates that he deemed beneath him, he was diabolical. On a daily basis, he subjected Leslie and Leslie's coworkers to humiliation, ridicule, and regularly created situations that turned the team members against each other. Which, sidebar, this is a strategy called triangulation, and it is intended to create distrust and dependence on the toxic manager. Richard was also openly racist and sexist and regularly used his hatred to alienate and abuse team members who didn't look like him. When I worked with Leslie, they already had been working with Richard for quite a few years. Leslie was about 2 to 3 years away from being able to leave the job, and Richard certainly wasn't going anywhere. Leslie needed to do something radical because Richard wasn't just causing professional harm. Leslie was experiencing a high level of psychological distress and started getting physically ill from the chronic stress of working with Richard. Luckily, she came to me to do one of the most important things to survive working with a toxic boss like Richard. She unpacked her toxic job bags. Through our work together, Leslie realized she didn't really care about Richard. It's not that she wished something bad would happen to him. Well, maybe that his toxicity would be exposed and he would be held accountable, but that's neither here nor there. But like, if Richard dropped dead from a heart attack, she wouldn't be dancing on his grave, but she wouldn't be shedding tears either. She also knew that most of her peers actively disliked Richard and were also being harmed by him. Leslie was a common target for Richard, but she certainly was not the only one. So she knew that what Richard said and did carried little weight with the people around her and junior to her at work. Most importantly, while Richard had the influence to plateau her career, he lacked the ability to demote or fire her. Leslie's relationship and reputation beyond Richard came into play here and provided a level of protection in this regard, which we're going to come back to in a minute. But in short, while Richard could make her day-to-day life miserable, he didn't really matter, which led Leslie to wonder, why was it impacting her so profoundly? It didn't take long in our work together for Leslie to realize that Richard wasn't the bruise. He was the finger poking it that triggered the pain and darkened it. This type of bruise wasn't going to go away simply by removing Richard from the situation. someone else would have come along and poked it just like he was. The only way to end the cycle was to heal the bruise. Of course, I recommend therapy to all of my clients because there are psychological aspects of this with very deep roots. But there were day-to-day professional implications and mindsets that Leslie had developed from chronically experiencing toxicity at work. In our work together, Leslie was able to release herself from them and not only be less and less bothered by Richard, but to feel empowered at work again, even when Richard did his best to stir up stress and drama. If you are being tormented by a toxic boss and you are ready to unpack your toxic job bags, I have a guidebook to get you started and accelerate your toxic job recovery. You can get your copy at toxicjobguidebook.com. When you release your toxic boss baggage, you release yourself from toxic people, which is the ultimate power move in my opinion. That said, there is a point that I just mentioned that we need to circle back to: the power of relationships when you're dealing with a toxic boss. Now, this is a strategy that will be heavily influenced by the size of the company that you work for. Leslie worked for a large organization. In some, there are opportunities to transfer to different teams with better managers and do almost the exact same job. In Leslie's case, transferring wasn't an option. Even if it was, it wouldn't have solved her toxic boss problem. Leslie had worked at the organization for a long time and had worked for other managers directly. Most were just as bad as Richard, and some had been Leslie's peers who were promoted off of Leslie's work, as we so often see in toxic work environments where favoritism and nepotism thrive. Leslie was never going to be a favorite or get the respect that she deserved, but most of the higher-ups liked Leslie. They knew Leslie would consistently produce results and exceed expectations, which made them look good. So while none of Leslie's contacts were necessarily going to swoop in and save her, they did provide a level of protection for her for one simple reason: performance reviews were by committee. While Richard still underrated her, her reputation was insulated from him egregiously undermining her work. Leslie also happened to be in a union environment that protected her from wrongful dismissal, and her pay raises were locked in by a collective agreement. These factors maintained Leslie's job security, which is typically one of the biggest threats by a toxic boss. Most of my clients have not had the union protections that Leslie had, but they have still been able to leverage their relationships and their reputation to protect themselves from their toxic boss. Many have gained visibility with their boss's boss and their boss to get promoted despite their toxic manager sabotage. Others have developed new cross-functional relationships to transition teams, and some even into new roles. This has kept them at companies that they liked, but that were being tainted by a toxic manager. Obviously, the strategy works really well if you're at a large or even a medium-sized company. Scale gives you options. But what if you're at a smaller company? I experienced workplace toxicity at two small companies that I worked at, and here's how I addressed it. The first one was when I was a new grad, and the founder and CEO of the company can only be described as unhinged. He treated everyone horribly, except when he was drunk and he would come in and hit on me and the other junior team members. Like, seriously, I gagged just thinking about it. In this situation, I was lucky because while he was the big boss, he wasn't my boss. So I was able to navigate ways to avoid him as much as possible. And thankfully, my manager was fully aware of how gross and toxic he was, and they did their best to protect me and my colleagues from him. The other small company I worked for was super tiny. I reported to the top boss, and there weren't any other bosses. He was the only one. I withstood a lot of toxicity and psychological abuse at that company, which I have talked about on my channel before, and it really became the impetus for the work that I do now. I daydreamed about walking in and telling him to F off, and I nearly quit on the spot multiple times when my boss was being the most toxic. But one thing stopped me every time. I needed the paycheck. I wasn't in the financial position to walk away at that point. But there's another side to the coin that I haven't seen anyone talk about. That toxic boss couldn't fire me, which brings us directly to the next strategy to cope with a toxic boss without quitting. This is the one that ultimately saved my confidence in my toxic job and has helped so many of my clients succeed despite having a toxic boss. One of the biggest mindfucks when you're working with a toxic manager is they're always telling you that your work sucks, that you're not good enough, and comparing you to your colleagues. This is something that Richard constantly did to Leslie. As I mentioned earlier, Leslie had been doing her job for a long time, and she'd been doing it successfully despite the fact that she had difficult, unsupportive, and overly demanding managers. Despite having a string of bad managers, Leslie was generally confident in her work before she started working with Richard. Of course, she knew she wasn't perfect. She was used to having her work critiqued. She was also the type of person that was really committed to her own professional development. She wanted to be the best, which ultimately kept her performance ahead of the curve. Leslie's results spoke for themselves until Richard came along. Richard started critiquing everything that she did. If she made a simple mistake, he didn't give her feedback to correct the error. He berated her and made her feel like a complete idiot. And of course, he typically chose to do this in front of an audience to maximize harm. He regularly undermined her results and focused entirely on negatives. As if that wasn't bad enough, Richard made a conscious effort to make Leslie's results invisible. He attributed her work to her coworker Chad. He undermined her results to other leaders. He did everything in his power to make her look bad. I mentioned earlier, Leslie luckily had an established reputation and relationships that insulated her from significant professional harm, but that didn't do anything to protect her from the most consequential damage this caused. Richard destroyed Leslie's confidence at work. His breathing down her neck, moving goalposts, and criticism had her constantly on edge. Leslie was on the defense, trying to anticipate what Richard would tear apart. Initially, Leslie thought that she would be able to prove herself to Richard. But with toxic bosses like Richard, nothing you do is ever going to be good enough. When I started working with Leslie, I had her do something that I have all of my clients do. I had her gather receipts. Your receipts should include things like projects that you have completed, quantified results, and progress metrics. Something I think is being slept on is working out loud. Share your strategies, your ideas, and your wins, not just with your team and your company, but on professional platforms. It could be LinkedIn, TikTok, or here on YouTube. But I've seen this time and again with my network and with my clients. When you make your expertise obvious, opportunities come to you, which is great if you want to escape your toxic boss. That said, the receipts that you gather really aren't for anyone else. I mean, you can use them as I mentioned, but really, the receipts are for you. When your competence is constantly in question, you start to question it too. This is something that I've not only seen thousands of times, it's something that I experienced in my toxic job. My confidence at point is pretty high. I developed a lot of self-awareness through years of intense bullying in grade school that forced me to develop self-acceptance as a massive weirdo who never fit in. While my toxic boss couldn't assail my self-esteem in general at work, he was able to cause localized damage. Gathering receipts, like how I was being asked to speak on stages at major industry conferences on the exact things my toxic manager was trying to make me question myself in, provided me with a reality check that I needed to heal. Receipts were also crucial for Leslie to rebuild and maintain her confidence at work, especially while she was stuck working with Richard. Knowing that she was going to endure toxic negativity about her abilities daily, I had her clock her receipts regularly. At first, this was really challenging for her, just like how it is for almost all of my clients. It's hard to recognize wins when you have no external validation. Over time, Leslie learned to spot her success, even when it was being undermined and criticized by Richard. There was one more important strategy Leslie implemented to survive her toxic boss, and this one helped her create and maintain inner peace when she was Richard's target at work. Now, before we talk about what this looked like for Leslie to help you implement it for yourself, I want to zoom out. There is something I hear in conversations and I read daily in my comment section, and it is the biggest mistake that you can make with a toxic boss. The impulse when you are dealing with a toxic boss, or really any toxic person at work, is to react. Like every time that Richard moved a goalpost and criticized Leslie for not hitting it, she wanted to call him out. Or when he unfairly criticized her work when she knew that it was done above standard, she wanted to clap back. But those are reactions. And I've said this before on my channel, and I will say it again a million times because it is one of the most important lessons that you can learn. Reacting is not winning. Your toxic boss isn't going to admit the error of their ways when you point out that they asked for the wrong deliverable. Managers like Richard lack the ability to take accountability for a simple mistake like that. And trying to make them do so is going to trigger them to lash out at the person exposing their incompetence, which in the scenario would be you. Which leads you to the question, what are you supposed to do when your toxic manager is overwhelming, undermining, or micromanaging you. Unintelligent people think that there are only two options: react or put up with it. Both of those options suck, and we are not using them. Smart people know that there is another option: respond with intention. When you respond, you hold your power in the dynamic without triggering your toxic boss to up the ante. One scenario that most of my clients have experienced, and Leslie certainly did, is their toxic manager dumps work on them with competing priorities. If everything is urgent and important, nothing is urgent and important. Richard frequently dumped fire drills on Leslie's desk. Often, these were reactions that Richard had to asks and imperatives of higher ups that he wanted to impress. Leslie was as efficient as she was talented, so sometimes this was a headache, but it wasn't really a problem. Other times, it put her in a situation where the timeline and the demands were impossible to meet. She learned the hard way that pushing back would only get ridicule. Richard would insult her ability and competence and go off about how this wouldn't be a problem for anyone else, which she knew wasn't true. But again, the situation was one where she did start to doubt herself. So Leslie would still be stuck with the impossible to accomplish and would be forced to fail, which made her feel even worse about herself and subjected her to more of Richard's verbal abuse. But once Leslie started healing, she started learning strategies on how to respond to Richard instead. Like, she learned how to put the onus of prioritization on him. This is way easier to do than most people think it is. It typically comes down to asking a simple question: which of these is more important? Posing this question to Richard forced him to make the choice, and without pushback or prompting, Richard would either readjust timelines or bother someone else. Leslie knew he didn't want to look bad, and if there were truly things that were urgent and important, he wasn't going to risk his reputation by setting her up to fail. Of course, your toxic manager isn't always going to be reasonable like that, even when it's in their best interest. And Leslie realized that getting the result she wanted when she responded to Richard didn't always leave her unscathed, but she was able to get to a place where she would be generally unbothered by his reactions by using the next strategy. This strategy is crucial when you work with a toxic manager. If you ignore every other strategy that I have shared in this video and you only implement one, make it this one, because you will be able to survive working with almost any toxic boss when you use it. I'd even go so far to say that this strategy is crucial for every important career juncture, whether you're working with a toxic boss or not. I've personally used it to get job offers, negotiate higher salaries, and create career success pathways that were beyond average and create an exceptional career in life. The most important thing that you can do for your career, and especially when you are in a toxic work environment, is detach. Almost every single one of my clients who has had a toxic boss, which is pretty much all of them, has hyperfixated on how their boss is treating them. They take it personally. But I need to tell you something, bestie. Your toxic boss's problems or personality disorders have nothing to do with you. When you realize that your boss's unfair treatment and criticism of you have nothing to do with you, you're gonna be unbothered by them. Being unbothered makes you immune from toxic workplaces. In fact, this is so important for you to do today, like right now. You need to go watch this video next, where I am going to tell you how to detach at work. I will see you there, bestie.